My God. I just watched the most horrific translation about goblins that I felt compelled to make this video. First, let me state, especially when dealing with lore that comes from the fairies, pixies or sprites, to note that they are habitual liars and seldom tell the truth unless there is something at risk that influences them to tell the truth. With that said, I will continue. First off, let us delve into the lore of goblins, because their legends have crossed over into many modern myths of today. Their magic was derived from the fusion of elements and mystic energy. The world's earliest known alchemists. One such modern legend that was born from goblin magic is demonic power. If my memory suits me, I believe the demonic influences of the world originated through goblin magic by combining the qualities of the imps and the golems in an attempt to make a type of golem that would not fear fire. Golems are forged from clay, so fire causes them to quickly dry out and become stiff and unable to move. So naturally they feared it. Imps, on the other hand, are devilish little creatures. I happened to actually see one when I was younger. I was getting the laundry from the dryer for my mother, which was in the garage. I turned to take them inside when I spotted one walking through the garage. He was about 3 feet tall at most and was a Danish grey color with a face that looked like a pug. He looked over at me and sneered, and then suddenly jumped into my trampoline that had what seemed like some sort of portal that was not seen by the naked eye until he jumped through it. When he did, it rippled a little and that was it, and he was gone. Golems, on the other hand, have been described as giants standing usually about 7 to 8 feet tall and built like a linebacker. Golems are unique for their traits of not being able to reproduce. Golems are only possible through a conjuring spell, each one being formed by someone's magic. They possess many qualities that are rare, such as the ability to be a shapeshifter, and they can become an exact duplicate of anything they see. If physically struck, they can separate into multiple miniature versions of themselves and later rejoin to compile themselves. Now back to the goblins. The legends and names of the most famous of the goblins would be those like the Goblin King Ogard, who was the first Goblin King. Goblins usually run in large packs of 20 or 30, so they never really had much use for things like kings. They maintained some order within their groups by going with whoever agreed the most won the decision, and if any still disagreed, then whoever first came up with the idea would be challenged in combat with the one who first disagreed with the group's decision. Until the day of the great fire that burned the fairy kingdom to the ground and left many of the fairy people without homes and scattered across the countryside. Also, may it be noted that fairies were the favorite choice of delicacy to the goblins. They were viewed like veal is to us, partially, from what I understand, that it had to do with the fairies' immense saturation of mystical energy within them, as they were comprised mostly of the mystical energy force known as mana. The Goblin King had won his title by being the one who organized the search and scavenger parties that hunted down the estranged fairies and brought about the largest haul in captive fairies any goblin had ever seen. Although this drove them close to the point of extinction if it had not been for the quick wit of the Fairy King's daughter, who had been captured long ago but kept as a trophy. She watched and learned the goblins' ways of magic, and one day created a fused hybrid of her own, and thus the pixies were first made from this. A cross between goblin and fairy, and very vicious when angered. At first the goblins thought the fairies had escaped until they got closer and realized these little fireflies had teeth and claws. With the goblins busy running from the swarms of pixies, the fairies practically walked out of bondage. The mana pool energy. I speak in depth about this energy in my previous videos, so I shall only graze the subject here. The mana pool energy is the source of all the mystical creatures' energy and is derived from the gravitational waves emitted by the core of our planet that transitions into various wavelengths as it passes through the crust of the planet until it reaches the surface, where it transitions again into a usable energy source they could tap into and use for various purposes, mainly geological, such as weather patterns, tidal currents and such. However, during the early age of the planet, this energy emission was much stronger and thicker than it is now, so it had a much more profound effect. Hence the evolutionary design of the early species of life on this planet that became the lost legends and myths of our fairy tales. After cross-referencing the simulated continental drift patterns along with the maps of Peri race, one of my cultural ancestors who are better known as the Magi, I have come to pinpoint the era of this tale to be that of about 350 million years ago, of that being the hybridization of the dragons, until the end of their culture's era, as told in the tales of Thoth's emerald tablets and also the legends of the Mayan homeland of Aztlan, to be that of about 158 million years ago. These species of creatures lived up until approximately 158 million years ago, and that time frame would have been the apex of their species' civilization, as the surviving legends and actual physical texts that contain proof of these events, such as the Nag Hammurabi in the Holy Book of the Great Invisible Spirits, mark that time period of 158 million years to be a time when the Earth began to change drastically, which not only shifted the physical contours of the surface but also the energy that they were comprised of, the mana, began to fade. I suspect what that means is that the planet was evolving and aging, so the energy of the mana pools changed with it and the frequencies altered, thus they're losing the connection they all had with it. The dragonkind were another species in this era, left over from the Mesozoic era that survived the great flooding that put most of the dinosaurs' fossils that have been uncovered dead and in the ground. Archaeologists have discovered that most of the dinosaur fossils found are not just singular graves and remains but usually a part of these massive grave sites containing hundreds of thousands of dinosaur remains grouped together in strips of miles wide and long grave sites. Geological survey says that most of these sites show evidence of a mass exodus caused by a flood event that covered the planet near the end of the Mesozoic era. Eventually the remaining survivors seemed to have been running away from the seas inland and abandoned their children halfway, as there is a massive strip of young dinosaur fossils found up and down the New Mexico, Colorado and Wyoming strip. Then as you get towards the central region of Oklahoma, Kansas and Nebraska, you find the parents in a massive strip of bones that reach all the way into Canada, buried and embedded in coal, which is formed by large quantities of vegetation compacted under the ground for long periods of time that eventually form into coal, or close to that. I'm not sure of the exact details of the process, but it's close enough. The point is that the survivors of this mass exodus event, from what I understand, that created the origin of the dragons was a hybrid species of velociraptor and pterodactyls. That near the climax of this catastrophe the pterodactyls took to the high ground. The velociraptors were very smart and knew their kind would be facing their end like everyone else around them if they didn't come up with a plan. That opportunity came with the pterodactyls. They realized even though they may be surrounded by water, the pterodactyls were able to fly off the island to get food, but this left their nest and their young defenseless, so the velociraptors, who were very agile as well and could climb to the tops of the mountains where their nests were, presented a truce. They would guard their nests and young while they left to gather food as long as they returned with a portion of food for them. This uneasy alliance gave the opportunity for cross-hybridization of the two species, which led to the development of the ones who became known as dragons, or basically velociraptors with wings. They grew to be much larger than their ancestors and flight was limited to short gliding, otherwise their wings would break under their weight. Most dragons died of this because once their wings were broken they would be easy prey to those on the ground. Also infection would quickly set in and they would die from that more often than anything else. Also might I add that the canonized texts of the Bible also contain information pertaining to the topic of the mana pools. It speaks of how the angels in heaven sustained themselves from the bread of the manna. I shall leave that at that and continue more on these subjects in a series, I think. So stay tuned for more Twilight Zone history from the Arcane Lore of Legends.
That's all, folks.